Welcome back to the flip side, folks, and as you can see, I've created a playlist for videos down here concerning Alaska, which to me is not just a place of incredible and outstanding beauty, but in the realms of the mysterious, it is the epitome of an enigma if ever there was one. Its dark history when it comes to unexplained encounters with mythical beasts become even darker, given that many end with the demise of the human participant. And this week's story is a continuation in that theme. It relates to the death of a particularly hard-headed indigenous elder and tribal leader, a Dene chief known simply as Stickman. Now, by all accounts of the evidence of this encounter, it was by no means a peaceful passing, in fact, far from it. This instalment from the flip side details of course of events that culminate in the interaction also with a mythical cannibal entity known as Gilyuk. It recounts an episode in the life of a legendary mountain man, a no-nonsense man by the name of Tex Cobb. This account is based on the writings of Russell Annabelle, a highly respected and regarded author who specialized in documenting the hardships of living in the wilds of Alaska. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to ask, if you haven't already, to please do subscribe to this, my new YouTube channel. I'll be covering a range of stories and accounts of adventures, daring accomplishments, and of course, crimes, whether they be solved, cold, or inconclusive. I'd also like to ask that you also slam that notifications button, after of course wrapping it in a warm jacket to avoid it from freezing in Alaskan sub-zero temperatures, thus leaving it at greater comfort and I hope willing to then notify you when new content is uploaded by yours truly. And as customary, I'd like to give a shout out to a few of the channel followers, and as such my salutations go to J Dogbutt, who actually pointed out this story to me. And beyond that, I'd like to say a warm welcome to new subscribers Tyler John Spivey, John Leonard and Terry Sadler. Also, many thanks go out to John Atkinson, Danny Mullen and Barry DeJasu for your much appreciated feedback and comments on recent uploads. Now lastly, I'd like to send out a little bit of advice to David Bryan. Mate, don't go through life being that angry all the time. Nobody really likes that sad, lonely and angry old man in the corner. Just saying. But anyway, folks, without further ado, let's get into this continuing instalment of Mysterious Alaska, with this compelling account of an encounter with the forest-dwelling and greatly feared cannibal entity known as Gilyuk, or Bushman, here on the flip side. The Dene Indian people of the Matanuska region of south-central Alaska liked very few of the white people that moved onto their lands. The select few, however, did include a trapper and mountain man by the name of Tex Cobb. But as a matter of fact, Tex was the nickname for a man called Arthur Allen Cobb, who was actually born in Texas in 1872. Now there's little history about the man except he was known to have been living in Nick, Alaska from 1911. Now, it was sometime after that he subsequently moved to the Matanuska Valley area, where he became a highly respected member of the local community. Now, with regards to his relationship with the local indigenous people, no sentiment was wasted on either side. Cobb and the tribesmen had a live and let live understanding that was rare in those days. He stayed away from their trap lines and they stayed away from his. If an Indian had a salmon net laid out in an eddy of a river, Tex would find another eddy, and vice versa. Now, due to the fact that the Indians trusted him, it was during one particular trapping season that he became involuntarily involved with what would be called back then the abominable snowman, or as we know it today, Sasquatch. Now, we've all seen and heard a lot about the abominable snowman, Yeti, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, call it what you will. From numerous photographs of tracks in the snow or of grainy and shaky video depicting what is supposed to be evidence of what we call Bigfoot. Now, while many of these accounts could be true, there remains as yet anything to give concrete evidence that such an entity exists. This particular adventure with what the Indians referred to as Gilyuk occurred while Cobb and his hunting crew were camped in a picturesque region of spruce trees on Yellow Jacket Creek, south of Tyone Lake. The account is told in the words of an unknown colleague of Cobb's at the time. We'd spent the entire summer on this mountainous Nelchina plateau, wandering and looking around for signs of fur potential. He, Cobb, always had to have an excuse for enjoying the country, and a commercial excuse was always better, if he could think of one. Anyway, on the morning in question, it was late September and what we called the beautiful time. There were no mosquitoes, the land was ablaze with colour, and the fish and all of the meat animals were all fat due to the summer feastings. The caribou hordes were gathering, and we were footloose and as fancy-free as perhaps no man could ever be again. In the morning in question, Tex was making coffee, and I was down by the creek cleaning a mess of grayling for breakfast. Now, I looked up just when 6 Indians filed in through the timber. They stood for a moment, gazing at our 4 horses. To them, horses were a rarity, a mysterious animal. They in fact called them McKinley Moose, because McKinley was the only president they'd ever heard of, and the horses were as big as a moose. Now, I finished my chores and followed them back to camp. Upon seeing them arrive, Tex approached. Have you eaten?" he asked them in the Dene dialect. They said they had, and it was only then that I noted that Chief Stickman was with them. I'd only ever seen him once before, at Eklutna village. Now, he was a squat, square-faced man, very dark with long hair and darting eyes. He was the Dene boss of the entire region, and boy did he have a bad reputation. Preferring as little contact with us white folk, it was only due to him being in a predicament that he couldn't handle that he'd come to see us on that particular morning. He told us about it while adopting a stance where the sole of his right foot would rest against the knee of his standing left leg. Now, I don't know if it was a bad habit or a medicine trick to ward off evil spirits, or both, but it just seemed a little bit disconcerting at the time. He proceeded to tell Tex that he'd come into this area 2 days prior with some of his people to kill and catch caribou for winter. Now, during their foraging, they discovered the Gilyuk, or the shaggy man as they called it, was hanging around in the region. They'd found a fresh sign of its presence the day before. Now, everyone back then knew that Gilyuk wasn't interested in caribou, because Gilyuk only ate men. "So what kind of signs did you see?" Tex asked. "We'll take you to see it," the chief replied. "It's not that far." So after breakfast, we followed the Indians upstream for a couple of miles to a burned flat, on which a nurse crop of aspen and birch had grown. In the centre of the flat stood a ruined birch sapling. It had grown about 4 inches thick and maybe about 10 feet tall. Now, somehow it had been twisted the same way that a man would twist a match. The wood had been separated into individual fibres and the bark hung in tatters. Stickman and his hunters stood back while Tex and I looked the site over. Now, moose will often rub a sapling down in order to get to the tender twigs. So do caribou. But no moose or caribou had done this. This had been done by something with hands. It had happened as recently as yesterday because the leaves of the sapling had not yet completely wilted. Now, it wasn't the work of lightning either, as there were no signs of burns, as would be associated with such an event. Nor had a freak whirlwind done it, because the trees and brush all within the immediate vicinity and the surroundings were completely undamaged. The hard ground also bore no tracks, and we found no snagged hair in the brush. Absolutely nothing except the incredibly twisted birch sapling. Now, it was without question the eeriest sight I'd ever seen in the wilds. Chief Stickman went on to say, "It is Gilyuk's mark, we've seen it before." Now, I wish to make it clear that to the Dene people, Gilyuk was no legendary creature that their grandfathers would tell them about. He was in fact a reality, and they spoke of him as the same way that they spoke of bears and wolves. They saw his signs, they even saw him as an entity, as a real person. He was a shaggy giant whose hair met in a tuft on his crown, and it gave him the appearance as if he was wearing a hat. And what's more, unfortunately, Gilyuk had the bad habit of eating men. "We want to ask you to camp with us until we have killed our caribou," the chief asked. "Gilyuk doesn't molest white men. Perhaps he would not molest us if you are with us in camp. Stickman had already told us that he bivouacked on the shore of a pothole lake 2 hours to the east, or so far, without any issues. Tex eventually agreed, saying that we would move to the chief's camp in the morning, and as he spoke he was still looking at the twisted sapling, his green eyes narrowed in thought. Now I myself couldn't take my eyes off it either, and then the chief surprised us all and said, "Thanks, Kosaki." Now that word, Kosaki, was a word of respect held over from the times past when Russian influence in the region was strong due to the presence of trappers who journeyed across the Bering Straits. After this spoken departure, we parted companies with the Indians. The next morning I brought the horses in at daybreak. We ate and broke camp and were just about putting the packs on the horses when again the Indians came in from the woods, all of them. All of them except, that is, Chief Stickman. One of the older Indians had told me that they were returning to their town on Tyone Lake, and he also informed us that Chief Stickman was dead. He said that Gilyuk had returned in the night and taken the chief after the chief had gotten up to go down to the lake, perhaps for water, but nobody really knew why. Now a squaw in their party with a birch bark torch found his red flannel underwear on the gravel beach. It had been torn away from him. Now there may have been tracks, but seeing as the entire hunting party had swarmed all over the beach, by daylight no tracker on earth could have made sense of the jumble. Now until the day of his own death in July 1962, while on a sentimental journey to a fateful spot in Cook Inlet, Tex was convinced that the cannibal giant known as Gilyuk had killed Stickman. When asked if he believed the existence of the abominable snowman, Tex would reply that he didn't think that there were any around Alaska at that time, but that they had indeed existed, at least a couple of them, a few decades prior. Now in further reading, an excerpt relating to the activities of Gilyuk, or Bushmen, as they were also called in the far north of Alaska. This is a segment from the 1971 book Yukon Trophy Trails by Dolores Klein Brown. Now one section of the book outlines one of her personal experiences at the time. Not only were there bad animals, but there were also bad men in the Yukon, Billy DeChuk says. There were fearsome black giants who ate Indians. And Billy once told me about the time when Indians fooled one of these black cannibals. They stuffed their skin beds with hay to make it look as though they were sleeping. And when the black giant had plucked up enough courage and crept into a teepee to eat them, the Indians stole in from behind and clubbed the cannibal to death. Now many times the Indians have scared the wits out of me by warning me about Bushmen, as they called them. Bushmen were said to live in caves or holes in the ground. They also had enormous feet. Once, when Louis was away and I was alone, Billy DeChuk came to warn me of a very big bushman in the area. He'd just seen his tracks not far from our old cabin and told me that if I ever saw the bushman looking through the window, I was to shoot him right through the glass and kill him dead quick, he said. Not wanting to face this bushman alone, I went to get Sarah Johnny. She wasn't eager to come and stay the night with me, but after a while she agreed. Now she'd never seen a bushman, but since her Uncle Billy had said there was one around, Sarah took the precaution of scattering tin cans so that, if anything did interrupt them in the middle of the night or walk past their cabin, at least she would hear if they came. Now, as there were no locks on the cabin, I wanted more protection than a tin can, so I wedged a knife sideways into the door jamb. Now, at around midnight that night, Sarah and I both sat bolt upright in our bed. The doors rattled from loud, heavy knocking and the big knife quivered. Sarah and I grabbed the table and the dresser and shoved them in front of the door. Next, we tried to drag in the stove, but it was just too heavy for us two little ladies. And we sat there for the rest of the night, shivering in fear, and both of us holding a high-powered rifle. Now, when I told this account to Louis, he roared with laughter. But no one can tell Sarah or me that there wasn't something big banging on our door that dread-filled night. I'm not ashamed to admit I was badly frightened, and especially for our guides too, who have faced many grisly charges without fear. It's a known thing that they avoid going into the woods alone at night because of the frightful bushmen. And my guides would also tell me that on trophy trails they had often come across scores of camps, so old that the tree stumps had been chopped up with stone axes. These camps are well hidden up shadowy ravines. We asked our guides why this was. Because of the bad people, the Bushmen, they would answer. Stone axes and crude spear points from these camps have been dated and found to be around 10,000 years old. So there you have it, folks, another name to add to the glossary of the entity we all know as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Now, I'd love to get a show of hands to see how many people out there think that the existence of these things is real. Now, for me, I'm on the fence. I'd love to think that there was something out there. I mean, new species are being found all the time. But given the way our planet is being decimated, though with logging, fossil fuel extraction and development for our expanding population, I'm pretty amazed that we haven't seen a lot more conclusive evidence of their existence yet. Now, nature shows from the likes of the BBC and PBS bring us pretty amazing footage these days of some of the most elusive species, such as snow leopards or Eritrean wolves, for example. But no Sasquatch. There's got to be a reason for that. Anyway, I'm sure people have got 1,000,001 questions about it. But that's all from me for this installment, folks. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that subscribe button, give the video a like and ring that notifications bell so that you'll be notified as and when new content is available from yours truly. Now, as always, I welcome any suggestions for future stories. So if you do have something you'd like me to present here on the flip side, simply suggest that in the comments below. But until then, all I can do is ask that you stay well, stay safe, and above all, stay healthy. So until we meet up again, here on the flip side, take care.